Hi, I'm Keith McCullough, and welcome to another Real Conversation. This one is my pleasure and privilege, really. I've learned so much in the last month reading his two books, and I try to keep a pace of a book every 10 days, but these ones are the big, thick ones, and they're of major historical consequence. He's very popular amongst many more of you than I would have known, but I'd just like to warmly welcome you, Peter Frankopan, to having a real conversation with me.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you for getting hold of me. I've been very grateful for your tweets showcasing my work over the last month or so. You know, as a historian, I feel very mixed feelings about trying to advertise what it is I do, but thank you very much for reading my stuff and for sharing it with your followers.
Yeah, what's interesting, like I write daily, and I think you've seen, I just quote you because it's easy to, and it saves me a lot of time actually, because people will actually learn something from you as opposed to from my rants. But trying to put the short-term cycles and the secular inside of these long time series. At first, you sucked me in with the it could be 2,000 to 3,000 years, and then your latest book, I have to go back 4.6 billion years. So we're going to try to, talk about, these massive gaps in terms of context. But first, I wanted to, just hit on you as, Peter the person. Because it struck me when your greatest achievement wasn't actually having this world-renowned history book, The Silk Roads, that all of our clients talk about, but it's actually playing on the Croatian national cricket team. So I just want to give you an opportunity to talk about that.
Well, I would have liked to play for the English cricket team, which play a few notches ahead, and you're hosting in the United States the World T20 Cricket Championships next month, in fact. But I'm from an old Croatian family and was asked to be president of the Croatian Cricket Federation about 20 years ago. And I always said, I was a reasonable sportsman. I played varsity for both Oxford and Cambridge. But I said, if you're ever a man short, please let me know. And I got the call up quite a while ago. They didn't call me back to come and play again, but I played a couple of times for Croatia in a cricket tournament. And I don't think that's my highest achievement, but it's the one I'm most proud of because it was the most unexpected, I guess. Let's put it that way.
How has that instructed your career?
It's a very good question. I mean, if I was, I talked about it with, I was at an event with Michael Johnson, the American sprinter, a couple of weeks ago. And, I was never good enough at mainstream sports to make it. And I was probably never good enough a historian of, Henry VIII, the American Revolution, the Third Reich. There are plenty of people who are smarter than I am. So I suppose the way I look at my career these days is to think I went into regions and areas where there's not a great barrier of entry, not much competition. So I work on things like Russia and Ukraine, Middle East, Iran, Central Asia, China, all places that are really important, both for history, but also for investment decisions. But they're very severely underrepresented at universities and criminally unrepresented in high school education levels. So if you ask most people about megatrends, long-term themes in Chinese politics, history, economics, likewise Russia, likewise Central Asia, likewise South Asia, or even Southeast Asia, people normally draw a blank. And if you're thinking about, forget about the long term, I mean, you said, Keith, 4.5 billion years. If you're thinking forward the next decade, next 2 decades, then I think it's really important to understand geopolitics, geoeconomics, and history, not just so that you can understand who you're talking to, but so you can understand some of these big headwinds that we're facing at the moment, because amazingly, this is not the first time in history when new technologies have changed the world, not the first time in history when religions have dictated wars and conflict, not the first time that military confrontation has reshaped our world. It's just that you and I have grown up in a world for the last 30, 40 years that things have looked generally pretty peaceful. If you look outside Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, things have, for most people in the world have got better. And that's a real problem if you're coming to an age of revolutions that we live in now, that you write about at Redeye a lot. How do you engage with change? And historians are quite well placed to think about those kinds of questions.
Yes, I mean, what I love about that, I have that in common with you. I mean, unlike sports where you have a natural ability and a certain, in my case, height, that's limiting. Whereas if you really want to grind on something that you have a passion for, which I like how you addressed that, to introduce the Silk Roads initially, that was my initial introduction. But I had to ask you also about your family, if you don't mind. You have 4 kids, and I can't even conceptualize what it would be like to be their history teachers.
I think my kids are no different to anybody else's, which is they are absolutely golden and they ask really smart questions of pretty much anybody else, but not of their dad. So, I think it's always an interesting one. It's much easier to bring up other people's children than your own. They've all done well, and I know that they're great because quite often I will talk to friends of ours who are their parents of their friends, and they will start telling us what they've been talking about when our kids go to stay with them, and they're absorbing quite a lot. But definitely the place that I feel dumbest is around my own kitchen table. But that's not a bad thing too. In England we're quite good at cutting down tall poppies to size and having chunks taken out of you by a 16 and 17-year-old who may after all be much brighter and smarter than I am. I learned a long time ago that's probably something to savor rather than something to push back against.
100%. I'd say, especially with my teenage daughter, where I have these same types of experiences. There are many times where the best decision is to say nothing. But I really I wonder if you consider yourself against, would you call that the establishment of teachings? When I was reading your book, I can tell you that I felt, wow, this really challenges the premise right out of the box. Do you consider yourself anti-establishment in your domain?
I mean, look, I'm a professor at Oxford and at Cambridge. That's pretty much central of the establishment. I connected into giving lots of government's advice in the West. So I mean, you couldn't have a more on paper establishment figure than I am. I suppose it's that I was very aware as a child of the Cold War growing up, seeing the Soviet Union point missiles at Europe. Seeing revolution in Iran, looking at transitions in China, particularly after Tiananmen Square, seeing the sort of the end of the Vietnam War and genocide in Cambodia, and then dislocations in the Middle East, famine in Ethiopia. It was pretty obvious to me that the most important trends in politics and in fact in economics were outside of Europe and the West. And you guys in the US have a robust big market. Our challenge here in Europe has been how to integrate. Do we want to integrate? Are we able to do that? We've got tons of different languages, laws, etc. We don't have a federal authority that really works in the same way that the US does. So, and our productivity has gone down in the last 30 years quite dramatically in terms of hours we work and length of holidays and the social care we have. So, I think I'm not an outlier, but, I spent the first half of my academic career without too many people paying me attention, which I'm kind of grateful for. So my 20s and 30s, I was an academic toiling away, and it just so happened that about 15 years ago, those worlds that I work on, Russia, Ukraine, China, the Middle East, Central Asia, South Asia, all started to move, and they started to move in quite a dramatic way. And I can explain that for people involved in the investment world. 20 years ago, so about 5 years after I'd finished my PhD, the economy of the United Kingdom was bigger than that of India and China combined, right? China's economy has multiplied by about 15, 16 times since that time. And so these things have natural consequences. And one of those challenges is to work out, what does that mean? What are the opportunities? What are the stresses that provide? And so, no, I think I'm absolutely mainstream. But you could go through high school and university doing a history degree, and you'll never hear a single word about Iran or even about China or about Russia, let alone places like Java, like Indonesia. The island of Java has a bigger population than Russia, right? But it doesn't feature in anybody's mainframe, unless you're a smart investor, and then you're looking at some of the startups in places like Indonesia with a market of 200 million people plus. That suddenly starts to look a bit more interesting and a bit more robust, particularly when those worlds are getting richer. So, I think I'm part of the mainstream. It just so happens that a lot of people in my position maybe focus on rehearsing old arguments rather than looking for new ones.
And kind of like the rote study of very short durations. I mean, I'm Canadian, so if you thought the teaching of American history within that very short-term lens is myopic, I mean, try that. I mean, Canada's a lot worse, and it's just it's a thing. So when you advise, because you and I have at least that in common as well, which is, institutions, governments in some cases, their pensions, they're asking for your opinions, and you have this super long lens. How do you make it practical? And is that even a challenge? I mean, to speak to somebody who has absolutely no idea what you're talking about?
I think you stick to fundamentals. I mean, that's the same for investment as it is for history, as it is for policy. It's what fundamentally matters. And anybody who's making decisions for the future, whether it's in a household, with their pension fund, at government level, is trying to separate noise from reality and to try to work forward, what is happening and what matters and what comes next and what does that mean for me? And I think that is, looking into the future, it's a real skill that I don't think that I really have. I mean, guessing what happens in the coming 10, 20, 30, 40 years, it's a mug's game. But on the other hand, some of the things that I've been worried about for the last decade or so have been things like pandemics. And I was in Whitehall in Downing Street, in fact, talking about that just before the pandemic, a month before the pandemic, before it was detected anyway. And those kinds of things are around energy and around what happens to in a changing world with energy security that's coming towards those of us who are investing in renewables. What are the likely consequences? And I think that it's not that hard a discipline to try to focus on what really matters. But in the noisy world of today, we tend to play the man and not the ball. We tend to think much too much about individual leaders rather than about structures. And we can get distracted very easily about fundamentally unimportant topics rather than things that really matter. So I think the most important thing that's going to happen in the next month, I think in the Americas, will be, does Mexico City run out of water? It's projected to run out of water 26th of June. What is likely to happen as a result of that? How well can Mexican authorities, private individuals, corporations, institutions, how resilient can they be in their planning in the next 4 weeks? What happens if things accelerate and that number comes forward? What happens if rains come and things get better? This morning here in Europe, we've had Dmitry Suslov, who's a pretty well-regarded Russian theorist, saying that he thinks that what Russia should do to warn off deployment of Western weapons on Russian territory is to detonate a nuclear device somewhere in Europe, because the sight of a mushroom cloud being streamed live on TV will concentrate minds to make people think about what tragedies and horrors a nuclear war will bring. And so those kinds of things maybe don't happen. Maybe Mexico City survives and the rains come and it's no problem. Maybe there's no detonation. But you should probably be thinking about what happens if they do, in terms of whether it's your portfolio, whether it's about your planning, whether it's about very basic things like getting food onto people's tables. And so history often is about very simple topics like energy, like resilience, like food, like water. And and what happens when you have new technologies that are adopted. And in today's digital generative revolution, it's not hard to see where some of those conversations move towards.
Yeah,
so I think history teaches you how to look at some of these questions.
Well, I mean, it really governs your thought process. And like when I think, what a humble thing to say. Like, I'm really bad at predicting the future, whereas everybody on the earth wants you to predict the future. It's in understanding the past. It's very much, in my language, it's a fractal approach to your analysis. So there are patterns, similar sets, emergent properties that repeat. So when you've studied them for as long as you have, then you see the front end of one and you're like, okay, that's, I've seen that, going back 2,000 years, you can actually see quite a lot. And I wonder if that's, this is Mandelbrot, that type of analysis that we bring to macro markets, and we think that's a much better way than like having this kind of linear econ view. Not insulting anybody at any of the academic institutions, I'd never do that, right? But on linear economic theory versus using a fractal approach, you embrace the suck of all those things that have happened going back since forever. And I wonder, I'm assuming you've thought about that. Do you define what you do as having a fractal nonlinear approach?
Look, I think I would never define myself with any kind of school, nor like very politely, Keith. I follow you and never take a shot at how anybody else analyzes things. But show me a pitch deck that starts before 1929. Show me a pitch deck that ever talks around, or even the last 30, 40 years. And some of these things, if you take the longer view, the rise of the West, the rise of Europe, are pretty recent. If you look at global history spread out over 3, 4, 5,000 years, Europe was at the wrong end of all the trading networks that are often called the Silk Roads that linked Asia together with itself, different regions, as well as with Africa, North Africa in particular, but also all of Africa and with Europe. And when you start to think, well, what made those networks fly? What made religions move around? What kind of commodities were being exchanged? And not just the high value, expensive stuff like silk or gold and metals, but what about how people feed themselves? What about deforestation? And at the moment, I'm particularly interested in climate change and change to the natural environment, because I guess that's the kind of second signature problem in the 21st century alongside the rise of China, India, Asia. The third one is the new technologies, and maybe that's something I write about next. But I think when you start to take a slightly more longer term view, then perhaps things come into perspective a little bit, and that can be helpful. What that can sometimes do is that, you like writing the Bible. There's like so much information in there. It's where do you go? So there's a bit of alchemy of trying to be detailed, but also boiling things down so that they're digestible. And it's much harder to write a one-page summary than it is to write a 500-page book. But I think it's important that each chapter I try to write tends to have a sort of theme to it that tries to flag out something that's going to be useful for people to look at that has a resonance for today.
Well, I mean, part of being a great author and a teacher and a coach is having the ability to simplify the complex. I mean, how you do that, and we'll get into, if you haven't read The Silk Roads, you can go through multiple roads that Peter is, and he basically names every chapter. The road to black gold, which we'll talk about, for example, which is oil. But I actually started my early look, Peter, with the road. I think you called it the road of religious faiths, road of faiths. And I use this quote from Peter. You guys can pop it up from the early look if you have it. And this is so prescient. You wrote this book, correct me if I'm wrong, in 2015, right? Right. So to say, what you said back then here, I mean, you could have just written that last night. I mean, in a world where religion seems to be the cause of conflict and bloodshed, it's easy to overlook the ways in which the great faiths learnt and borrowed from each other. That's not what people wake up thinking every morning. I mean, I think if you look at like my world, the hedge fund world, they're trying to figure out like our tension's going to rise in the Middle East tomorrow or by next week. I mean, can you take a step back and contextualize this moment in religious history? I don't know how you'd like to characterize it in the Middle East, because I think that can give people a better appreciation. I don't know if the word appreciation is the right word, but a better level of sophistication on how deep this runs.
Well, look, like you said, it's fractal. People get on with each other until they don't get on with each other. People respect each other and are willing to have a migration, willing to have people come from different countries, listen to different faiths until they're not happy. And often it's small events that can trigger massive significance. And sometimes those effects are dramatic and bloody and devastating, like 7th of October or September the 11th. That those things can change completely how globally we think about Islam, how we think about Israel, how we think about Gaza. Those things, they can have massive significance in the same way that, an Austrian archduke in Sarajevo in 1914 being assassinated can trigger the First World War, that amongst all the different things that it did, apart from the horrors of the trenches and etc., that I guess the three most important things that came out of the First World War, things that we don't tend to think about when we teach that at high school and at university. Number one is it prompted the creation of the American empire, right? It transferred wealth from Europe directly to the United States. Second, it completely transformed Russia from a imperial autocratic into a different kind of autocracy that was brutal and intolerant. And I guess that had an impact also on changing the course of history in China too. And now those three elements, all to do ultimately tracing back, not really because a guy was shot in Sarajevo, but because everybody decided that was a good moment to escalate. And I think that those choices of when do you escalate are almost as interesting as when you choose not to escalate. So in answer to your question, Keith, I think it's a bit like investment decisions. It's how big do bubbles get before they suddenly pop? When do you suddenly get vulnerabilities into systems that look resilient? And in fact, it's very small impacts, black swan events, as Nicholas Nassim Taleb has called it, that can suddenly cascade things downwards. And I think we don't price that into how we think about supply chains, how we think about prices, how we think about risk, because we assume that the world is logical, we assume it's rational, and we assume that people decide when they want to pick up their arms and fight or when things collapse. But, you look at a bat in Wuhan, that single bat, apart from the fact it locked us all up inside and maybe improved some people's relationship with their kids, maybe not others, spiked interest rates, spiked prices of shipping, produced all these escalator impacts that we didn't kind of pick up at the time, but we should probably be prepared for about what happens when there's a sudden shock event. So I'm particularly interested at the moment in things like shocks, about what is it that can suddenly take economies that look like they're performing well and suddenly produce moments of proper existential crisis. And as in your world, that's about price and about what happens if there are bubbles that pop. But it's the same question I think you're asking with history about what is it that makes religions suddenly go for each other, where they've kind of got on oftentimes okay. Here what we're seeing in Gaza and Israel, in the worlds I work in, particularly in Southeast Asia, I don't know whether that comes through into your hedge fund world, but McDonald's and KFC's have been boycotted in Malaysia and Indonesia for the last month because large populations of Muslims around the world say, how come the Americans are sending weapons to allow the Ukrainians to defend themselves against the Russians, but not sending weapons to allow Palestinians to defend themselves against Israel? And how those protests escalate, it starts with fast food chains being boycotted, anything that looks or sounds like it might be American, but that can move very quickly into other forms that depress earnings, that have livelihood impacts on people's jobs, not just in local countries, but back in the US too. So those global fragilities are obviously heightened when we have globalized supply chains. And when we've seen horrors like this and they don't look like they're going to end anytime soon, then things look like they will get worse before they get better.
Yeah, and again, when you speak, it's like I'm listening to, there's a series of emergent properties and causal factors. The thing that actually sets it off was in the making the entire while. I mean, in the US, for example, it's quite frequent that my Jewish friends will tell me they've never, it's about feelings, they've never felt this strongly. Some of them aren't religious at all, but they've never felt this strongly about something or strongly about their, I guess, even their uncertainty. I mean, so just things that are open and honest conversations that I've had with people where it really gets to their identity and questioning what that really means and what it might have to mean now. So I wonder, with that having said, like if you just take, because you do this in your book. I mean, I learned so much from the history of the Muslim faith. I didn't know any of the dates. I didn't know. Again, this is something I need to learn if I can try to empathize with the other. It's not the other side to me. I'm not Jewish or Muslim. But if you take the three big ones, I mean, and if you disagree, if there are others to address. If I take Christians against Muslims, or I take the Jewish faith against Muslims, I mean, how does that resolve itself? I mean, if it's Iran against Israel and then it draws in, if you call the Christians the American, side, I mean, I don't know how to think about that.
Well, I guess it's education. I mean, there are more references to the Virgin Mary in the Quran than there are in the New Testament.
Yes, I didn't know that until you wrote that.
So, and I think that, the early Islam has put up inscriptions around mosques and places of worship that says Jesus Christ is the Son of God and he rose from the dead after the third day. So, the borrowings that we have, all of us, we call ourselves Abrahamic faiths because we all trace our ancestry, whether you're Jewish or Christian or Muslim, back to Abraham. And, probably something comes through education about teaching kids this, whatever denomination they are. But when you don't teach and you don't allow people to understand what you're talking about, what true history is, then of course history gets hijacked by people who want to radicalize by boiling the messages either down into something too simple or something that is actually wrong. And I think that's something which we see not just in religions but with nationalisms too. So I think that the challenges I think we have about how do we give people the information that they need to understand the world in reality probably starts at primary school, goes through secondary, goes through university and into policy levels. But we don't know enough about other faiths. We don't know enough about other parts of the world. Most people can't name a single Chinese film star or Indian pop star or Russian contemporary artist or Arabic novelist or novelist writing in Arabic or West African, name it. Sports star, footballer, artist, novelist. And when you get used to admiring your own reflection in the mirror, it can become very, very tempting to look at yourself and to admire what you do well without thinking about how you look to other people, but also how do you have conversations with people who you don't know anything about. And in our world today, all of us need more friends. We need to build alliances. We need to be able to network each other, to be able to share ideas. And I saw an interview yesterday with George Yeo, who was Singaporean foreign minister for 7 years, a cabinet minister in Singapore for 21 years. And he says, look, the main difference he sees in the world today, apart from wars and conflict in Gaza and so on, is that Asia feels to him more wholesome than the West. People are investing in their children, they're investing in education, they're making long-term investment decisions, whereas in the West, we're trying to scalp each other. And now, he might be right, he might be wrong, but what's interesting is when you travel a lot, as I know you do too, Keith, that you hear people who say things that you that don't make any sense to you, right? It doesn't make any sense when most of the continent of Africa either abstained or refused to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And if you don't listen to what other people are saying, then it's quite hard, I think, to be able to not just work together, but it's quite hard to share common ground. And that seems to be like a critical problem where 85% of the world's population are not based in the United States or the West. Those are your markets. Those are your challenges. Those are your opportunities. And it's quite hard because surprisingly, money doesn't just talk. It's also about having relationships and investing in one-to-ones. And, if you don't do that enough, then you're out of position.
Mm-hmm. I mean, does that not just make the die cast? I mean, like if today's society, particularly in the West, is to look inward, and now there's this identity, thing that's purely about religion, one against the other. Your version of history would submit that if that dogma becomes as pervasive as it's become, there's no shot at empathy or a debate on why not to have that moment, like you said, that can happen it can happen tonight.
Well, look, in my whole lifetime, I've never seen the United States this strong. Just look at the value of the Dow, look at the new technologies, look at the West Coast, look at Silicon Valley. And yet you talk to people in America, well-connected, smart, educated people, or people working on factory shop floors. They talk like the United States is failing, right? And Trump is pandering to that by saying, we've got to make America great again. America somehow is a failing nation, rather than this is the most robust economy in the world. It's the greatest country on earth. It's by far the single greatest military superpower. It has no threats strategically from the north or the south. Your beloved Canada, Keith, doesn't look to me like it's going to start a war anytime soon. Likewise, Mexico. Everything in the United States looks pretty good to me. And yet you talk to your average person who thinks the American economy is failing, the American government is decrepit and corrupt, that there's inefficiency everywhere through the system, rather than there's a reason why every single person wants to go and live in the US from all over the world. And that's a sign of strength. But when it gets spun the opposite way around, it can antagonize and it can create volatility. And some of the questions in the world that I work on is that the US looks like it's a bad partner at the moment because the US doesn't want to play ball. It's trying to say to people, choose us or China, rather than how do we work together. Everybody wants the US as a partner, but the isolationism that has become an important part of American foreign policy, and to some extent economic policy too, is something that gets felt with shivers in every continent you want: South America, Central America, Africa, Asia, Europe, where we think, gosh, how are we going to cope without the US alongside us? And that those two different spinning plates of a hugely powerful and dominant and dynamic US on the one hand, and then one that sort of is scared of its own shadow on the other, that thinks that everything it touches abroad turns to dust. I find it incompatible, the narrative with the reality. And like I said, as a historian, stick with the reality.
Mm-hmm. Well, in isolationism, nationalism, et cetera, versus like even last week on a macro show, I was like, wow, Putin, when he met with Xi, might as well just kissed him on the face. I mean, these are, there are other things going on, new partnerships, et cetera, developing, while, again, there's a very, different view, particularly from the American side. But if I tie that back to, and I did mention it already, the road to what you call black gold.
Right.
And, you make a very good historical case that this, Iran and Iraq are created. It was all about needing and having to have access from the British side, the American side, to that natural resource. I mean, is that not the same reason why Putin wouldn't kiss Xi on the face publicly, to have the same type of access?
Well, Putin's got a problem, which is he's managed to balance his economy reasonably well for the last couple of years, despite sanctions. But his oil and his commodities are in a difficult geographic location to ship them to China. So there is a pipeline that runs across to China. There's talk about a Power of Siberia 2 pipeline that hasn't been built. Chinese have actually pulled cold water over it with a meeting between Xi and Putin last week. So I think that although China and Russia look like they've got lots in common, and they talk about how they've got lots in common, the war has been an opportunity for China rather than a challenge. It's given China access to cheaper Russian goods. Mm-hmm. It's allowed them to see how Russian military material, that is a large part of the PLA army's military hardware, how poorly it's performed in conflict, which is quite an important lesson for the Chinese to learn. It's been quite important for the Chinese to see how battleground decisions have been made by Russian generals have not gone according to plan. That's been a kind of win for PLA2. But Putin has got to find some way of trying to look for a story that is sellable around the world. And China are listening, because the story of the West being in decline, decadent, and needs to be stood up to is one that works quite well for China. But the Chinese, I think, are not wedded to that as a story. But Putin is able to keep his war effort afloat by exporting particularly oil and gas, but also metals too, which Russia happens to be ecologically blessed with. But as we transition into clean energies, we in Europe, we don't have any oil in any particular volume apart from North Sea oil fields. So, the reason we want to transition to clean energy is not just because we think we're going to save the environment, but also so we can have energy independence, so that we're not in hock to plans hatched in Moscow that involve, bombing Ukrainian cities and kidnapping Ukrainian children. So, these things sometimes come together for the same way. And I guess the same thing happened about 120 years ago. Most of the Industrial Revolution had been powered by fossil fuels, by coal. And when oil became commercially viable, exploitable, it was much cleaner, more efficient, easier to transport, less bulky, more efficient, etc. The scramble to take control over oil fields became an acute challenge particularly for European countries, and above all for the United Kingdom. And that was one of the reasons why the maps got drawn up at the end of the First World War that have been part of the problem for Syria, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, etc. ever since, because of the distribution of fossil fuels just happened to have been there, and the ways in which countries in Europe have tried to secure those over the long term have folded into foreign policy, military policy, and so on. And it turns out that if you make bad decisions, or you make decisions that are trying to get the goods for the cheapest possible price with no attention paid to what local demands and needs are, then you can make tricky situations much, much, much worse. And we're all complicit, the United States too, in what happened in Iran by doing the same thing of helping build up a kleptocratic, autocratic regime under the Shah. And then that got replaced by something much worse, because, of course, explaining to local Iranians that they were sitting on vast volumes of oil that they didn't get any benefit from, it's not hard to spin that as being both unfair and requiring a more aggressive solution. So, if you are not part of the reform problem or reform solution, then you're part of the problem. And oil was a part of that. As it happens, one of the things I'm working on at the moment is 4 of the 6 Gulf states are due to run out of oil in my lifetime. As we transition to renewables, one of the questions will be, what happens in the Middle East? Already 390 million people in the region who are water depressed, very high temperatures. If prices go up, if food becomes in short supply, if water becomes a problem, there's a logic of where that ends. And we should probably be thinking about where are the opportunities and where are the challenges that poses to all of us. And just because you're a long way away in the United States and Canada, it doesn't mean you're removed from some of those major geopolitical, geoeconomic, and human challenges and opportunities.
Well, in particular, actually, if you take both books, by the way, Peter's latest book is called The Earth Transformed, which we have on the display. But
thank you, Keith. Keith's getting 10% of all my sales while we're talking.
But I mean, just if you just read, the beauty of the book is that at least for me, is that it reads go back 4.5 billion years, and then you again try to compartmentalize, which is a Herculean task really that that you accomplished, is putting everything in frames of massive amounts of time, but again across the entire time series. But what you find is that the winners, whether they be the Mongols crossing the steppes or whoever it may be, the winners end up being those with the most resources. And I don't know how. If you're on the road to empire, to use your words, which I think in the Silk Roads is one of the better chapters, why that wouldn't be everything that you care about, all that you care about. And then there's the road to gold, the road to silver you've written about. We're seeing a massive amount of gold buying by the Chinese. Let's do that one. Road to empire from here for the Chinese, challenges and or things that an American looking inward may not see.
Well, look, you guys at Hedgeye, this is one of the things you focus on is about commodities and new commodities, and that list changes all the time. 120 years ago, oil was secondary to coal. That shifted. Today, it's things like rare earths, it's things like silicon, it's things like the cycle of what's required changes. Even in terms of food, we don't think about that enough in our basket of where we think about markets. If you look at the single highest commodity that's gone up in value in the last 20 months, it's been olive oil, right? You see the same things with hikes in things like prices of cocoa. I know cocoa's come down a little bit in the last couple of weeks, but for quite a while this year, a ton of cocoa has been more valuable than a ton of copper. And a lot of people describe copper as being the most important commodity of the 21st century. You see orange and orange juice prices have quadrupled in the last 2 years. And that's a function not just of more of us on Earth with more disposable income, it's also a product of environmental stress that we're going through at the moment. We've seen reports in the last 10 days that parts of the United States in the southeast have gone down by 10 inches, or sea levels have either gone up or the ground has sunk by 10 inches in the last 50 years. And those kinds of changes that we're living through, we don't pay enough attention to about what environmental shock does to food supply, to water supply, and to disease environments, and to the kind of things that we should be thinking about, even in terms of basic problems around insurance. So, you've done that a lot at Hedge as well, around big storm systems, what that's done for these massive storms that come through the Caribbean and devastate Florida and the Southwest. But I'm looking at what are called kitty cat storms at the moment. So lots of small storms, particularly in Tornado Alley in the Midwest. And when you start adding them all up together, those impacts are absolutely catastrophic in terms of the damage they do, how that affects insurance premiums. We've seen just in the last couple of years, people like State Farm refuse to insure new properties in Florida or California because of the risks of wildfires or because of the risk of hurricanes. And so those kinds of things, you would, I think, as a historian, you think, where's supply and demand, where are the risks, and what kind of stage are we living through that's changing? Are these storms going to get worse? Are they going to become more damaging? As we live in a richer world, do we think that those are going to have impact? I mean, again, this afternoon, we're a few hours ahead of you here in the US. I've been looking at new data on how climate change impacts likelihood of earthquakes. And last week I just been out in Singapore. The flight I was on, SQ321, I was on 3 or 4 days before the one that dropped through air turbulence. We know that climatic changes makes air more difficult for planes to fly through, particularly to spot turbulent conditions. So all of those things, they might worry you as a passenger, they might worry you as a consumer, but they should also be worrying you as an investor. And they should be worrying you about what are the escalatory effects that we can't really see, because those butterfly wings, they flap a long, long way through into all of our pricing and all the way we think about the world around us.
So if ostensibly Putin is on, at least in his own mind, road to an empire of his own shaping. You have China, you have the U.S., et cetera, but you have that finite resource, or set of resources, to your point, and you had scarcity embedded therein, but you also have the safety of that. I mean, I could have, cocoa is a very obvious example because you can't just go get some in Oklahoma, but uranium. I mean, these are, the types of commodities that we're long, that we're invested in currently. I mean, that's the main point, right? You have scarcity and you have a lack of safety of those resources. Many people aren't going to go just dig up a new mine in Kazakhstan of uranium. I mean, these are not the types of things that could happen like tomorrow, like an AI chip. But I wonder, is that something that's the next war? Who controls the safest, broadest resources?
I guess that's the most obvious way to look at it. You're probably right, Keith, that scarcity leads to confrontation, right? There's a logical narrative to that. I'd probably see it a slightly different way, which is that scarcity leads to innovation. It would be my view, and that what happens when you are when there's less to go around, you become much more efficient and you become incentivized to become much more efficient. So, for example, things like how do you minimize waste at the farm gate? How do you minimize energy expenditure? How do you optimize the water resources? I think when budgets get tight, and we know this from our own households, right? When budgets get tight, it's true you can cut your saving, but the first thing to do is to be more careful what you've already got in the fridge, what you've already got in your household already. And I think that the tools that we have these days are going to help us hugely with those, particularly things like AI. So, I mean, you mentioned mines in Kazakhstan. In fact, there are a lot of projects right now around mining using artificial intelligence and new technologies that make the identification and exploitation of mineral resources far more efficient, much less wastage of capital in terms of opening up new resources, but also getting stuff out of the ground, and also that can be done in a way that's environmentally maybe not damaging, but it's much less damaging than the haphazard way. So I think that there's lots of reasons to think that a changing world and ones that has these problems, actually the way to look at it is not let's batten down the hatches and worry about confrontation. That might well happen, but maybe there's a more progressive and optimistic way, which is where are the opportunities and how can you get the balance right between being rewarded for those and to share the spoils of those rewards in a way that is effective.
Well, what's interesting about that answer, and we only have probably time for just this question because I know you're on a clock, you're a busy guy, but that want and that demand, it's interesting to hear you say that because there's such a short-termism to it. I mean, if all you have to do is look at a stock market chart of NVIDIA and you see this is going to happen now, change now, innovation now, this is the solution now, 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 now. And here I'm talking to the guy whose book starts with, actually I can tell you right now, from the dawn of time, which is 4.6 billion years ago, to 7 million BC, right? Long time.
That's only one chapter. Most of them cover 20 or 30 years, but yeah, I get your point.
Wall Street would just as soon as have this all priced in by the next NVIDIA quarter. I'm not kidding.
Number one, look, NVIDIA is worth more than all the energy stocks on the S&P 500 put together, right?
Yeah.
So, these things, they're all the bubbles and the realities that are different things when you get people speculating on what the future might involve. I mean, in fact, that chapter that I write about, amongst the things you might find interesting, a reader might find interesting, I know you've read it already, Keith, and like I said, thank you very much for having me, is that who gets to the White House in November is going to be shaped by climatic changes that happened in the Carboniferous period 230 million years ago. So how trees, animals, and plants all died over a period of tens of millions of years, a long, long time ago, is where the coal deposits are in the United States. And there's no coincidence that Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, particularly the three big swing states that will shape whether Biden or Trump get into the White House in November. And we pretty much can know which way California and New York are going to vote. We're pretty good on having a sense of most states. But there's a reason why those ones matter, and it's because you've had big coal industries, big populations that settled in cities like Minneapolis and so on to service coal industries. As those have died out and no new skills have been added, then you've got lots of voters who want to think that the future might offer them something different. So that those long-term fundamentals are really important to understand today. So it's not just thinking, well, what's happened in the US over the last 20, 30 years? How do we read history that way? It's how do we think really deeply around those decisions? And it's a very similar story, funnily enough, with voting patterns in the Southeast, particularly places like Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, etc., around soil fertility and where plantation complexes were built, the highest levels of enslaved peoples were located. Those have long-term effects that you measure not just in your year or 2 years or single presidencies, but you measure over decades and in fact even over centuries because they have long legacies. And those long tails, they do wag pretty deep and pretty intensively, and we ignore them at our peril.
Yeah, and you in your books, and we are out of time, you really just give us an education or a starting point on something so basic like why is that copper mine there? Why is coal there? Why do we have these things and where did they come from? And like I said, you have the humility to say what a lot of people don't say, which is I don't know on what's going to happen next. But this is a tremendous body of work. It doesn't surprise me that it took a couple more years than you might have thought to become, mainstream, as you called yourself. You're the coolest mainstream guy I've met. First of all, on that front. But I appreciate you doing all this work for everyone in this good world that's willing to learn and for spending some time having a real conversation with me.
Thank you, Keith. Well, I hope one day that we have a glass of wine or a cold beer somewhere. We can talk about this and more in person. But thank you very much for having me today.
Yeah, I appreciate that very, very much. That's also a resource that we're long of. We're long of the wine, right? And the downside to that asset allocation is that you just drink it, just like you did that conversation with a fine historian and a modern day one at that. Thanks for joining us.